Alapan Bandyopadhyay is the former Chief Secretary of State for the Government of West Bengal and currently the Chief Advisor to Mamata Banerjee, humble Chief Minister of West Bengal. He has also had a distinguished career as a journalist, one of the most notable figures in intellectual landscape of Bengal. His books include Amlar Mon, and he has also edited several other books such as Prosango Gorkhaland and Philosopher's Stone, Speeches and Writers of Sir Daniel Hamilton. He is joined right now by Avik Chanda, Alison James, and Lina Ferreira. That is me. And with that, let's get started. Thank you so much for joining us, Alapan. Would you join me in welcoming Alapan to CANTO today?
So today's session, Avik, we thank you, Lina, we thank you, Alison, we thank you, is on inheritance of loss, deprovincializing the partition of Bengal. So what is inheritance of loss? I suggest it signifies a very deep inversion of the way we think. Typically, we in Bengal at least speak of loss of our inheritance, how we have lost what we could normally otherwise inherit: our land, our houses, our ponds, water bodies, our rivers, ecosystems, maybe our hills and mountains, our community contexts. So we lose those inheritances when we get uprooted, when we get partitioned, truncated, when we become refugees. But Avik and Lina and Alison has coined a very beautiful and sensitive phrase to invert this usual thinking. Loss of inheritance becomes inheritance of loss. So inheriting loss would mean what? It probably means inheriting a sense of nothingness, inheriting a sense of void, inheriting a sense of death. How does one inherit a sense of loss and void and death? Since this is a poetry festival, an internationally organized and assisted poetry festival, I first quote from Shankho Ghosh, one of our more eminent poets from Bengal. Incidentally, he was trained once in Iowa University. Iowa University, I find, is one of the co-sponsors here. A refugee himself, once a resident of East Bengal, what is now Bangladesh, Shankho Ghosh, coming back here to West Bengal, uprooted, refugee, displaced, writes, and I quote in Bengali first, I will give the English translation. Ekhono kirtan khola, ekhono ki ache sei naam. A bit later, amar shorir shudhu jege othe tar kache gele. Translation goes like this. Is it still Kirtan Khola? Kirtan Khola is the name of a famous river in East Bengal. Is it still Kirtan Khola? Does the name still exist? My body gets aroused only when I go to her. So the displaced, partitioned, uprooted poet feels alive, aroused, awakened, enlivened only when he thinks of or approaches that river of the childhood, that lost river of the lost land, Kirtan Khola. When we inherit loss, we also inherit a desire to die, a desire to break, a desire to lose and further lose. Sunil Gangopadhyay, another eminent poet of ours, another refugee, writes, Amra shokolei bhangoner probokta, dhongshei amader ullas. We all are advocates of erosion. In destruction lies our euphoria. ঈশ্বর থেকে সুধীন্দ্রনাথ বুদ্ধদেব বসুর ছন্দ পর্যন্ত আমরা ভাঙতে ভাঙতে এসেছি। From God to the prosody of the elder poets, we have broken them all. কৃষ্ণনগরের পুতুলের মতো আমরা ভেঙেছি বাবা ও মাকে. We have broken our fathers and our mothers as they break the clay dolls of Krishnagar. প্রেমকে ভেঙেছি অতিরিক্ত শরীর মিশিয়ে. We have broken love by mingling too much of body. শরীরকে ভেঙেছি আত্মহননের নেশায়. And that body we have broken in the intoxication of self-destruction. দেশকে যারা ভেঙেছে আমরা মহানন্দে ভেঙেছি তাদের ভাবমূর্তি. Those who had broken our country, we have broken their images with great glee. কাচের গ্লাস ভাঙার মতন সুমধুর শব্দে আমাদের পায়ের তলায় গুঁড়ো হয়েছে এক একটা মূল্যবোধ. As a glass breaks with fine sweet sound, so has each value been broken into pieces under our feet. So inheritance of loss signifies inheritance of this kind of nothingness. But it also signifies a continued legacy of fractious fights, a dogged desire to keep on losing, to keep on being divisive. Partition of Bengal in 1947 gives rise to partitions and partitions and partitions yesterday and today and tomorrow in our quotidian lives every day. These several partitions keep on truncating our lives, our lands, our peoples, our camps, our political parties, our NGOs, our communities, our habits and our habitats. Nirendranath Chakraborty, another eminent poet of ours, again displaced, refugee, again from originally East Bengal, later rooted in West Bengal, writes his famous poem, Bhagabhagir Khala, the game of partition. He finds that the people even today in Nondigram and Shingur, in the political fights of 2006 and 7, they get encamped, they get partitioned, not because they wanted it, but because the intoxication has entered our blood. The poet watches the game. He knows he had seen the partition once when he was a child. And now he sees this partition, these partitions of our everyday life incessantly. মরিনি বলেই এই খেলাটা আমিও দেখে যাচ্ছি. Since I am not dead, I keep on watching the game. দেখছি আর ভাবছি যে 47 থেকেই বোধহয় ভাগাভাগি খেলার এই নেশাটা আমাদের রক্তের মধ্যে ঢুকে গেছে. দেখছি আর ভাবছি যে ভাগের মা গঙ্গা নাই পাক, এই ভাগাভাগির নেশায় আমাদের গঙ্গা যাত্রা করিয়ে ছাড়বে. In translation, I'm watching the game. I'm thinking that probably it is since 1947 that this intoxicating game of partition has entered our blood. Watching and thinking that even if the divided mother does not get to reach the holy Ganga river at the end, this intoxication of partition will ensure our end without fail. So we feel destined, and some would later say in their proses, and I'm not discussing those proses since a poetry festival today, in short stories, in novels, in plays, that we play like the tragic Oedipus, the original Greek hero of tragedies, who keeps on destroying his parents, himself and his children. We also, in an Oedipal mode, keep on destroying our parents, ourselves and our children almost in a destined mode. But this is still a provincial story. We are discussing partition of Bengal in the Bengali language as encapsulated in Bengal poems. I had requested Avik, Lina and Alison to deprovincialize this experience of ours. The question is how to deprovincialize this sense of loss, this sense of overwhelming erosion, this sense of self-destruction, how to situate our particular provincial thoughts and feelings globally. Avik, let us discuss how to deprovincialize our overwhelming sense of loss and nothingness. Thank you.
Thank you, Alafanda, for that introduction. I'm not going to take up too much time. I'm just going to allude to some of the conversations that you and Lina and I had together when preparing for this event. And since we've started by talking about partition, let's first talk about the fact that the partition didn't just affect Bengal, but the partition was also in West Pakistan and Punjab. And this is one of the things that you had in fact asked me, that if we are looking at the poetry of the 40s, the late 40s, and even the 50s, and we see this absolutely searing impact of the partition, completely transforming, transfiguring the literature of Bengal, are there any parallels when we go to Pakistan, right? Or particularly poetry in Urdu in Pakistan, if I remember that was your question. And one of the preeminent poets of that particular time, hailing from Pakistan, what soon became Pakistan, is Faiz Ahmed Faiz. And Prem Bhingechi, which you said, right? The implosion, the brittling away, the breaking away of the finer sensibilities, the subtler sensibilities, of love in particular. Hopefully we'll get to talk more about that. That plays a very important part in Faiz Ahmed Faiz, Alapan Bandyopadhyay. So for example, there's this famous ghazal, I'm not going to say the entire words, but Mujhse pehli si muhabbat meri mehboob na mang. Oh beloved, do not ask of me that love of old, because those emotions are gone, those sensibilities, those subtler feelings are gone. And gone to what? And this is where Faiz has this genius of just transforming the banal, the quotidian, into something much deeper. And his answer is, it's gone into a sense of nothingness, where it's not dark, where it's not light, where it's not day, where it's not night. I'm just paraphrasing, and then I'll just say a few lines in Urdu. It's a very short poem. And so that's the external thing, and that's being mirrored here. There is no love, there are no sensibilities, there are no feelings, there is even no lust. There is no belongingness. I'm just sort of paraphrasing. That's it. And now I'm going to say those lines, or try to, in Urdu, because I'm guessing that most of you would be fairly comfortable with Hindi and Urdu. So he says, इस वक्त तो लगता है कहीं कुछ भी नहीं है. इस वक्त तो लगता है कहीं कुछ भी नहीं है. ना महताब, no moon, ना सूरज, ना अंधेरा, ना सवेरा. शाखों के दरीचे में किसी हुस्न के चिलमन अब आके करेगा ना कोई ख्वाब बसेरा. Then, okay, maybe I've made a mistake. शायद वो कोई वहम था. मुमकिन है सुना हूँ गलियों में चाक का कोई आखिरी फेरा. And now it's that very famous set of lines. अब बैर न उल्फत न कोई न रिश्ता, अपना कोई तेरा न पराया कोई मेरा. So, Faiz Ahmed Faiz. Alison, from perhaps an European experience, if you'd like to. And don't have to agree, I mean, you could have completely.
I can say something, but I perhaps have a comment that is coming more from my point of view. So I teach French literature, so I'm thinking about a body of literature that I'm more familiar with, which is sort of post-war European literature in the wake of World War II, the Holocaust, and of course this experience of of genocide, incredible destruction on a huge scale, and displacement. I was perhaps a little puzzled by your emphasis on the desire for loss, or this kind of ongoing self-destruction, because from my point of view, the writers who I'm thinking about, and this is people like Charlotte Delbo, Georges Perec, I can think of a few others, but their emphasis is on actually a kind of seeking repair, or seeking to find some kind of way of recovering traces, for example, through testimony, or finding points of anchoring. This is a term that comes up a lot. So responding to displacement by a kind of gestures of appropriating space, which can be sort of urban space. This can be through projects that are very grounded in the city, artistic projects of kind of describing cities. But this is a response to loss, right? You're trying to recover a space that you've been told is not yours, or a space that was not originally yours. So perhaps I would emphasize perhaps the other side of the coin, so not the desire for loss, but the desire perhaps for repair, recovery, a kind of form of resistance that comes through the work of memory, remembering, kind of gathering together the threads of the past. So I could say more about some of the writing I have in mind later, if you like, but I just wanted to raise that point.
If I may, like, take off from there, I think Alapan brings up a really fascinating question, and I've had a lot to think about since we had our conversation. I think to that, what you bring up, there's a desire to sort of make amends and make whole. And Alapan's question of, are we drawn then to the loss? Is the loss itself? And I think that there's a way to breach the gap between these two ideas, which is that there is, the present is a living organism that wishes to preserve itself no matter what. And there's only one way to look back, and that's linearly. Everything in the past has always led to the present, and the present must be meaningful, and it can only be look back directly at the past. So every time that we talk about these moments of breach, these breaking moments, these partitions, or these moments of war, or these moments of displacement, these breaks create cracks in that linear timeline when we look back and we're trying to make meaning of the present, which is to say that we do not know what could have been. And when we do not know what could have been, we do not know if it would have been better. We do not know if it would have been worse. And the present, continuously trying to preserve itself, continuously trying to maintain itself as a viable, meaningful place to exist, it wishes that there is nothing else, that there are no other breaks, that all other alternatives are not as meaningful as the one that we have now, because then we would be necessarily less meaningful by extension. And that is a very difficult reality to grapple with. I think we have the bad habit of attributing the courage of the survivor to that which they survived. That if the oppressor had never been there, then perhaps they never would have had the cause or the opportunity for heroism. As if the blade that cuts through the skin of the hero has within itself the germ of heroism, rather than the hero itself being able to rise. And if he had not had that cut, if he had not been attacked, if he had not been oppressed, but perhaps there would have been no heroes, and then the present tries to reassert itself, isn't there some glory in heroism? Isn't there some glory in surviving these terrible things that happen to us? But in the words of Ursula K. Le Guin, this is the betrayal of the artist. If it hurts, repeat it. As if we have forgotten how to describe a happy man. Because peace is not the opposite of heroism. And to be whole, to have meaning, isn't the opposite of the songs that can come. Because the history may be written by the victors, but songs are sung by survivors. And the footnotes are perpetually written by the sons and daughters of those survivors. So I think that it's very difficult to sort of parse through the reality that the present can be continuously meaningful, whilst not rejecting that the alternative, without a break, would have also been meaningful. And perhaps even more filled with meaning, because there would have been more people to give meaning to it, if that makes sense.
Lina, slightly tangential, but lest I forget, this is something that you brought up earlier during our conversations together with Alapanda, and particularly when you're talking about displacement being uprooted. I think the audience would be particularly interested to know about the trials and tribulations of that experience from a Latin American perspective. You know, something that you have probably grown up with, or you've seen and you've known. And that doesn't need to be partition. It can be civil war, it can be insurrection, it can be... Yeah.
Certainly. Now, I should mention that I myself, I'm an incredibly privileged and protected person. I love the soundtrack of all of this. I don't know if this will make it, Nitesh, if the mics can pick up on all of that, but to talk about war while somebody's hammering in the next room is going to be quite powerful if you can fit it in there. So I'm from Colombia. I'm born and raised. You know, my entire family has always been Colombian for as long as Colombia has existed as a country. And which means that we have also been there for every single one of those wars until my generation, where my parents looked around and decided that it was just quite too violent to bring up 3 girls. I have 2 sisters. They had 3 daughters. And they decided to send us to the States, which they thought would be much safer. Which hasn't always been true, for the record, but it was in response to a period of in Colombia history, we call it the violence. Now, for the record, I grew up in the 80s and the 90s, which were more violent than the period that history books called the violence in Colombia. So that should give you some context for the number of like deaths and tolls and how the many permutations of that civil war. And it was very difficult in my teens watching hundreds of thousands of people being moved from the countryside into the capital where I'm from, where I lived, holding signs and trying to explain their situation in as few words as possible with the mark of crayons and Crayola markers. At the same time, knowing that where they were coming from, the education wasn't enough perhaps to make those words make sense. So all of these signs weren't well written because before the war there's always a lack of education. And so to consider all of the poetry that was lost, you have to first consider the reasons of the war, and before you consider the reasons of the war, you have to consider that to have a war you have to be hungry, and you cannot have poetry if you cannot write at all. So it was a very difficult period for the country. It continues to be a difficult period, but that moment of displacement, up until that moment, Colombia had per capita, I think, the highest number of displaced people in the world, which we're not a very large country, so that should give you some context. And a lot has been written about it, and I think that this is what Alapanda brings up, that is very meaningful, which is that a lot has been written, a lot continues to be written, and more importantly than being written, a lot has been done to try to counter that. A lot of people have stood up in ways that they never would have stood up if they hadn't encountered such a catastrophic situation of humanity. Nevertheless, there are so many more that cannot stand, period, than those who are able to stand up, given the circumstance, that it is a very difficult devil's arithmetic to begin to really try to comprehend the state or the creative space or any possibility after the displacement when you really consider that the worth of a human life cannot be contained in numbers, in days, in breaths taken, because a human life is infinite in its possibility for the things that it could have created. So when we talk about souls, even if you are not religious, we're not really talking about purely religious metaphysical concepts. What we're talking about is that when we encounter one another, life is so much more than words can contain. That metaphors are the admission of the failure of language. When we use a metaphor, what we're really saying is we do not have enough words to say what life is really about. And when we encounter each other, when we say soul, it's a metaphor for the greatest metaphor of all, which is the human life. How are we to say what a life could do and what it could be? And one life being snuffed out could be every Sufi poet that ever lived. We do not know, because they never came to be. So it is very difficult, I think, as one of those Colombians who, quote unquote, made it out. I went to the States, I got an education, I've published a book. And I have to carry the notion and the weight of all of those who couldn't. And as a person that grew up in the moment of displacement, I can tell you that I will never live up to that. And I would trade anything for not having to think about that.
If we complicate the discussion a bit, and if we introduce another level, my question to Avik was, in a sense, this: could there be a literature of despair? Famous phrase of Albert Camus, that there can be no literature of despair. Now, I have often wondered whether displacements, migrations, exoduses can be of varied types. In some cases, hope remains alive. Typically, the Jews would think, next year we will meet in Jerusalem. Typically, they would think that probably they will go back to their promised land. In case of many migrants from Europe, America was a promised land. In case of probably many poor in South America, migration to North America, United States, would be a partial, but nonetheless substantial journey. But what happens to a community when they think that they have lost 2/3 of their original land? They are now confined to 1/3 of their original land, densely inhabiting a land which can afford no further agriculture, full of unemployment, sliding down the hills, fast and irresistible, thinking only about a glorious past where they cannot go to, thinking about the bloody ordeals that their forefathers or parents or their relatives faced, and then probably becoming aggressive, but not having a sword to wield. The aggression is confined to their tongues. So a toxic heart, an aggressive tongue, and always taking resort to verbal duels remain the only pursuits of that palpably vanquished, displaced community. Is such a sense of despair commonly known in other parts of the world? Or is it a typical Bengal phenomenon, a sense of overwhelming loss that we see from which there is almost no redemption? Do others necessarily see such things, or have others managed to see redemption from out of these nadis, if we may put?
I would say there is a literature of despair, again, thinking about the Second World War and the post-war literature. There's a literature of the absurd, which is often treated as a kind of metaphysical abstraction, but I think has to be seen in that context. It's a response to a world that has lost its meaning because of this experience of violence and rupture. So I would say that, yes, there certainly is. So to that extent, perhaps we can generalize, from to say this is an experience. There are different kinds of experience of loss and on different scales, but there is often literature that tries to grapple with these. I think it's also always very tricky, because often this literature that comes from trauma is very fraught. It's often literature that runs up against the limits of representation and naming. I mean, I think this is part of what Lina was gesturing to as well, this sense that the writing will never kind of be enough, that the writing is in some ways necessary as a response to the experience. but at the same time, it's never going to suffice, and it's never going to completely repair the loss. So I'm thinking of a phrase from, again, the writer Georges Perec, who's a French writer, but who was born, his parents were Polish Jews who had moved to Paris, and they died during World War II, his father on the battlefield and his mother in the Holocaust, and he wrote in his autobiography that, to quote Perec, writing is the memory of their death and the affirmation of my life. So I think that, l'écriture est le souvenir de leur mort et l'affirmation de ma vie. So there's always this kind of doubleness to writing. I think it's both this kind of, it both keeps it's a kind of scar, right? It bears the mark of this loss that can't be repaired. You can. It's always a kind of trace that's going to be insufficient. At the same time, it's a kind of self-affirmation. Maybe this is coming back to Lina's point as well about the present, the force of the present, right? That we have to affirm who we are in the present. But yes, I would say there's always this kind of, I don't know if this is a way of replying to your question, but there's always this kind of doubleness to the writing of, this kind of writing of despair, which is sort of between this affirmation and this sense of irreparable loss.
I think it's. I'm so glad you brought up that quote. Could you say it in English one more time?
It's writing. Writing is the memory of their death and the affirmation of my life.
Yeah, it does connect so well, and I'm so glad that you brought it up. Because again, when I think of myself, when I think of my sisters, like, can you think of yourself differently? Like, you've worked so hard. Like, it's almost impossible. Mm-hmm. It's always wishful thinking. But I think more importantly, and to bring me back to your point, I'm thinking of Art Spiegelman and his phenomenal work of graphic memoir, Mouse. Mm-hmm. And he is a second generation inheritor of loss, to be specifically terming this specifically back to Alapan's question. And I don't know if you're familiar with the work, but his father is a survivor of the Holocaust, and Art Spiegelman takes an enormous amount of time and effort to record his father and then to illustrate it graphically and create this graphic memoir of his father's loss and by extension his own loss. And he's very candid to express. By the way, he won the Pulitzer with this work, which is an extraordinary feat if we're talking about literature. In addition to that, he's very candid about his own misery and the questions he has about what to give his son. And he drew one comic over and over and over again where he's holding a box and he's giving it to his very young son, and his son asks him, "What is it?" And he says, "It's trauma. This is the thing that we have in our family. This is what you have." His son opens it, and 1,000 snakes and monsters and everything comes out. And Art Spiegelman asks the question of what is the purpose of trauma and what should we do in context of, you know, something as horrific as the Holocaust. And the Holocaust is horrific, and we should remember it continuously. But we should also remember all of the other events of horrific displacement and genocide. It is not unique to one group of people in the world. Art Spiegelman phrases it in the question when he's being interviewed by the German media, and they say, "What should we do with this same box, this same gift of trauma? Are we supposed to feel guilty forever?" Mm-hmm. And Art Spiegelman answers, "Yes, maybe. Maybe we do feel guilty forever." Mm-hmm. If some groups are going to be passing down this box with monsters and trauma and guilt forever, wouldn't it be better if we all felt more guilty together rather than having one group feel trauma occasionally and wait for the next genocide for us to then have something to write about and make movies about and then give awards for?
Really, really powerfully put. And Lina, while you were talking, I was thinking about not just the responsibility of the survivor or the successful person, someone who made it out, to be a representative, to be the standard bearer of their community, of their clan, of their region, of their world, as it were. But there's also the guilt of survival. And I was thinking specifically about poets in Europe who who were in labor camps, who were in death camps. And I was thinking particularly of Primo Levi in Italy and of Paul Celan in Germany, remain in Germany. And one of the things that comes up very strongly in both the poetry of Primo Levi and Paul Celan and even other people who were displaced, such as Ingeborg Bachmann and Nelly Sachs, is that feeling of being not just dispossessed, but uprooted. You know, you have roots, you have anchors, you have memories that are embedded in the soul, and that is being uprooted, and that I think is quintessentially Bengali. It's not just in poetry. I mean, you look at the poetry of celluloid, Alapan Bandyopadhyay, all of Ritik Ghotok is that. It's the poetry of being uprooted, and I'm just reminded of this particular line or two from Paul Celan, from one of his later works called Niemand's Rose, which is no man's rose, and he's going through this period where, you know, this. I mean, he's actually deconjugating, decoalescing everything, and he's writing German almost in the way that Samuel Beckett wrote his last text. Very, very reductive, very elemental, just powerful. And there's a line which goes, sorry for the bad pronunciation, in der Luft, das bleibt deine Wurzel, da in der Luft. So when you say, in the air, that is where your roots remain, up there, in the air. So what he's doing is it's a very potent symbol, which in fact they've made that into a sculpture or installation in one of the main Jewish museums in modern day Germany, not surprisingly, taking that from Paul Celan. But he is suggesting that the way traditionally German poetry or European poetry would be written, the language, the motive of that itself has to be upended, the roots going up, I think.
So Avik, are you saying this feeling of being uprooted is unique? This feeling of, no, I'll come slowly. This Holocaust was a tragedy inflicted, let us say, by the bad upon us. Bengal partition was a tragedy which was collectively manufactured by all of us through our collective sins. The difficulty in case of Bengal partition is there is no villain which comes to our fore in order to give us the chance of redemption by contrasting ourselves to that dark character. We are all villains, we are all victims, we all realize it was through a collective guilt of ours that our land was tragically divided, and as a people we could not stay together. There was no, unlike West Pakistan thing, there was no moment of dramatic exodus, there was no moment of bloody swapping of people. It kept on bleeding bit by bit, and that slow, tortuous, gradual, cancerous bleeding made us weaker and weaker and weaker, and we realized that we met this tragedy for ourselves through our sins in the last several hundred years. It has been our own making. There is no redemption, and this cancer will go unstopped, and the dejection and the despair and this feeling of being uprooted, probably legitimately, and feeling of being lost, probably irreversibly. Will you say this is comparable with other great historical tragedies, or does it have some unique element also? That was my specific question.
Not very sure about that. I'll probably sort of defer it to Alison and Lina to comment on that. But when you were talking about collective guilt or the allegation, the assertion of collective guilt, I was just suddenly remembered of Kobita in Bangla, written almost in nursery rhyme style, but Tele shishi bhangla bole kukur opor rag koro, তোমরা যেসব বুড়ো খোকা ভারত ভেঙে ভাগ করো তার বেলা
I was not referring only to that.
Yes, but
because
there is that.
we were incapable of showing greatest amount of empathy for the multitude of our society, they revolted and threw us from much of the land which they now occupy. The old aristocrats' sense of guilt vis-a-vis their erstwhile serfs, the empire's guilt, the colonizers' guilt. How do the empire-building people and the colony-building people, how do they reconcile themselves with their shrinking to their own native land? So I would say the Holocaust tragedy, the sense of guilt that a colonizer has, make a blend which is there in Bengal. We knew we had once made a society where everyone didn't get equality. Those who were getting unfair treatment rose in revolt, hence the land got partitioned, hence many of us had to recede, and the tragedy continues, as historian Ranjit Guhoud said, because of our own original sin. So when a tragedy happens because of our own original sin, the despair looks a bit beyond redemption. Does this have any resonance globally? That was my question.
I think it's a fascinating question, and I'm glad that you're posing it. Now, for the last year, I've had the great pleasure of working with Avik. Without Avik, there would be no CANTO. CANTO should be equivalent or synonymous with Avik, period. And I've had the great pleasure of working for the last year. I got as many books and anthologies of Indian poetry and history as I possibly could, and I know only that I know nothing about this incredibly long and complex history, so I will not pretend to know many of the details of which you speak. So I will speak just to your question, which is this unique or is this general? And I think I might be able to speak on your behalf as well, correct me if I'm wrong, the only answer that can be true is yes, to both. It has to be unique in order to be universal, and it can only be universal if it is unique. And if I may add to that, the essence of that question or answer, which sounds very much like avoiding the question itself, only exists as an evasion because we have the notion of the them and the us. So when you talk about this region betrayed itself in a way, we created our own tragedies. I can relate to that very much. Colombia has not been fighting other countries, we've been fighting ourselves. But I can relate to that far more when I think about the fact that as a human species, we haven't been waging war against lions, but against ourselves. So the we, the them, the us is the thing that makes it universal. And the person itself within it is the thing that makes it personal. So when we talk about the universality, we talk about the tragedy, but when we talk about the person, then we talk about poetry. Because the person creates poetry, not the circumstance.
Alapan, I'll just take one quick minute, because one of the things that you talked about or asked about is also the guilt of the colonizer, particularly in the case of the British. There are many archetypes, and we don't have the time to discuss all of them, but the predominant amongst them clearly has been Kipling with Ganga Din, where it's the archetype of the white colonizer assuaging his guilt for exploiting, for whipping, for depriving the native of that which is his own, all out on paper, like blood on paper. Ganga Din, you should read this. It reads a little dated, but that really epitomizes what you're talking about.
This concludes this panel. We're going to wait 5 minutes and then start the next one. Thank you, everybody, for attending. If you would join me, one last round of applause for Alapan Bandyopadhyay.